So behold my new talk title, and I want to linger over it for just a moment as a way of more clearly mapping out the conversation I hope to begin today about the futures, notice the plural, of theological education, and the work we might do together from all of our various spaces to raise up a larger and more diverse leadership for this church, which I think we can agree this church desperately needs. So that dream is our endpoint, a conversation about local formation and the futures of theological education. But our starting point is over here with this phrase, firmly rooted. I'm curious if anybody recognizes that language. I'm not sure anyone here is old enough or nerdy enough to recognize that language. Is that doing anything for you if your name is not Peter Wilde? Firmly rooted. Now, that is an affectionate shout out to Canon 9. Does anybody know what Canon 9 is? Okay, so Canon 9 is an old canon that was done away with in 2003, but it was basically a provision for ordaining people to the priesthood locally, such that they were, if you can imagine this, a priest within sort of a radius, right? It was removed from the canons, like I said, in 2003, but I'm starting here with Canon 9 because of how powerfully it still shapes our sense, I believe, of what we often call local formation and how local formation fits into the larger formational landscape. And that starts with the very designation of the kind of formation we're going to be talking about today as local. That language comes straight out of Canon 9 of the ordination of local priests and deacons. So we're just going to read it, mark it, inwardly digest it, right? And just sort of take this in, okay? With regard to dioceses with congregations or missionary opportunities in communities which are small, isolated, remote, or distinct in respect of ethnic composition, language, or culture, and which cannot be provided sufficiently with the sacraments and pastoral ministrations of the church through clergy ordained under the provisions of Canon 3.7, it shall be permissible for the bishop, with the advice and consent of the standing committee, blah, 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 to establish procedures by which persons may be called by their congregations and the bishops with the standing committee to be ordained local priests and deacons to serve the congregations or communities out of which they are called. And actually Canon 9, it makes some really important ministry possible. We can't, and it arises out of a real and important need in its time, and we don't get to where we are today without it. And that has costs and benefits. So you're absolutely right to point out that even here, with all of the problems that it's so easy to identify in the rearview mirror, there are also real urgent pastoral concerns that continue, and in fact, if anything, have multiplied today, right, and extended out far beyond the isolated and remote areas which Canon 9 imagines these conditions might apply. And of course, this thing goes on and on. We're nowhere close to done. It goes on for a long time about the natures of the processes to be established. And the overall effect of Canon 9, once you get to the end of it, is to establish two things as defining characteristics of the locally formed clergy person. And here they are. First of all, local formation has relaxed formational standards. That's what gets established here. And then firm rootedness in a particular community, which is why I chose the title that I did. It's an actual quote from the language of the canons. It says that these priests and deacons shall be recognized as leaders in the congregations and shall be firmly rooted in their community. And this is now a moment to gesture to, there is beauty and goodness in that language, right? That I think we're in some ways better positioned to see today than we were even in Canon 9. So this is a very mixed bag. And that is precisely my point, that the DNA of what I'm about to talk about, like all DNA, is ambivalent and ambiguous. And it's important that we look at it so that we can understand where we've been, where we are, and where we might be headed. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what the implications are of these relaxed formational standards and the firm rootedness. When I say relaxed, I do mean pretty relaxed. Here are the criteria as they're defined in Canon 9. Locally formed priests need to have been confirmed for 5 years. All right, that's nice. They need to know what priests and deacons are, and they should want to be one. They need to demonstrate, and I'm quoting, adequate knowledge of the scriptures, the creeds, and the catechism. And finally, and I love this quote, and I do love Canon 9, y'all, I'm just having fun, but this is my favorite quote. They need to be able to, quote, read the Bible in their prayer book in an intelligible and reverent fashion. So they should be able to read. That's good. They need to be able to read. And once again, I'm not piling on this canon just because, just for fun. It did meet a meta need in its moment, and it opened the door for our own. But it is important to sort of unpack some of the assumptions, some of which, now I want to say, have always been wrong. So, for example, first of all, many, if not most, Canon 9 priests and deacons were far, far better trained than this canon required. Oftentimes, the choice to ordain a person in this way had as much to do with a bishop's plan for a particular clergy person or their own plans for their life than it did with the level of preparation they were bringing to ministry. Secondly, it's not like Canon 7 priests were at the time or have ever been or are now all formed the same way. There has not now and never has been a specifications in the canons that clergy people go to particular seminaries or that they even have MDiv degrees. In fact, if we were to call this reading for orders instead of local formation, it becomes instantly clear that the church has been ordaining people who haven't gone to seminary since before there were seminaries, and it never entirely stopped, right? In some ways, local formation is one of the oldest ways of forming people that the church has. And some of what we've been talking about are some of the reasons that the church stopped ordaining people under 2 different canons in 2003. Now, all priests are ordained according to the same canon, so if you're locally formed, that doesn't mean that you necessarily are firmly rooted. A priest is a priest is a priest, right? And the reasons they stopped doing it had to do with their recognition of some of the things that I just said. That Canon 9 was producing quite good priests in many respects. But it also had to do with the ways that the world was changing. And I'm going to name just 2 big things, but there are lots more that we could talk about. Those 2 big ones are the internet and the subsequent availability of online education. We're at a point in the Episcopal Church where if you would like to get an MDiv degree, you can get one of those either online or at a residential seminary. That would not have been possible at the time that Canon 9 was authored, right? And the other big reality, of course, is the dramatic decline in church attendance, such that more and more churches are in this position of being unable to afford a priest who is trained in a more normative for the 1950s and 60s, maybe, sort of way. So we have a church that looks really different from the church that this canon was written for. And once again, remember, right, the assumption of Canon 9 is that the number of churches who can't provide sufficiently for fully compensated clergy are the exception, not the rule. But here is the emerging reality. And don't blame me for these statistics. You can blame Matthew Price. He's the Senior VP for Research and Data at the Church Pension Group. And these numbers have changed a little bit since, I think they have a sort of new, the numbers have gone up in the latest data, but not significantly enough. This is roughly right. Here's the emerging reality. And I should say that when I heard Dr. Price present this data for the first time, he did not use the term bivocational on his slide. He just called it the emerging model of ministry. And the emerging model of ministry in the Episcopal Church is one in which most priests, regardless of their training, will derive at least some of their income from a source that is not a parish they serve full time. Now, I should be clear here that because of the way CPG aggregates the data, what is included in this percentage are priests who are serving multiple calls in a single diocese. So they're full-time employees of a diocese, but they're serving multiple calls. And it also includes priests who are serving a diocesan entity and a parish. So for example, a priest who also works at a diocesan school as head of school or for some other entity in the diocese. All of those models of employment are included on this slide. So we're not just talking about people who are making part-time pay, working a part-time job, but still, it's a fairly striking statistic, I think. And that doesn't count deacons. I'll just let this slide speak for itself. Deacons have dramatically changed the face of the church. And obviously these two big shifts have all kinds of implications for how we think about theological education, because at least some, I'm going to just go back to priests here for the moment, at least some, if not, although not all, of the people who are going to be willing and positioned to work in this emerging model are going to need more accessible models of theological formation, some of them at least. And when I say accessible, I mean economically accessible, because if you're preparing, especially if you're preparing for part-time pay, then that changes the kinds of decisions you might make about the financial sacrifices you might make to go to a residential seminary, including the financial sacrifice of putting your paying job on hold, all of the lost income when you could be putting into a pension plan that you're sacrificing while you're in training, all the income your spouse might be sacrificing while you're in training, all the costs of moving away from family, right? Like all of those things, what we're finding is that people, as they consider seminary, are thinking about those costs ahead of time, looking at these kinds of statistics and making decisions with their bishop about whether or not their particular situation merits the risks of, or merits the, I should say, the financial and time investment of residential formation. And the picture just looks different. It's not simply, in other words, that back in the good old days, people were willing to sacrifice for this vocation, and now people are selfish. It's actually simply, it's that the landscape has changed. Also, more people are moving into ministry midlife, and that too changes the calculus that you have to do as you think about whether or not seminary formation is for you. And so there's logistical costs that you have to calculate, and economic costs, and we know that we need more accessible models in order to account for these. And you'll notice that I said models and not model, because number one, I don't think high quality seminary education should ever be decentered as our template for good theological education. There are plenty of Christian denominations who have already done that. I think it's pretty clear that the world really doesn't need any more biblically and historically illiterate Christians, right? So we're always going to need scholars and communities that are dedicated to learning, to be the sort of to undergird the work of the church, and who help us do the work of reading and telling the Christian story. It just may mean that their role in the future is somewhat different, and that everybody doesn't have to come to the center, that the center might be being asked to do to do work this way, as opposed to everybody coming into the center of learning. The center of learning might need to begin to think creatively about how it can provide access to the broader church. But we're always going to need seminaries because, and we're going to need some other models because the challenge before us is just too big for a single fix. I'm sure you've all heard about the clergy shortage, so I won't throw out any statistics for you about that. We're going to need to use all the resources at our disposal to raise up the next generation of leaders. So that means online MDivs, that means low residency programs, and it also means what we've come to call local, but maybe more properly thought of as diocesan formation, right? Diocese-centered formation. And since that's what we do at Seminary of the Southwest through the Iona Collaborative, raise your hand if you're here as part of an Iona Collaborative school. It's also if you're here with Bishop Kemper. Bishop Kemper is a school of local formation. Anybody here with Bishop Kemper? Okay, no. What I'm going to do now is zero in on the Iona Collaborative's part in this story as a sort of part of a much larger story. It's just exemplary, and I think it gives you a feel for how local formation is working right now and what some of its affordances are, some of the good things it makes possible, and what some of its challenges are. Okay, so here we go. Whoops, sorry. Really quickly, a timeline. This is a little history lesson. Our part in this story goes all the way back to 2004 when a need is identified in the Diocese of Texas for clergy to serve in small congregations all over the diocese that cannot afford a priest. And so to meet that need, the Iona School for Ministry is founded. That school continues to this day with a mission of training up priests, deacons, and now lay leaders to serve in non-stipendiary roles all over the diocese. And it is modeled on traditional seminary education, and that model was easy to replicate at the original Iona School because of its proximity to Seminary of the Southwest. So here's how it worked. It worked kind of like an executive MBA. Right? If any of you are familiar with the way that works, a person goes instead of showing up every day of the week or many days of the week to a university, instead you go to possibly a satellite campus and you do that one weekend a month for an intensive, and then you have a series. You do that for a longer period of time, and then you have a period of exams. The Iona School worked a lot like that in its original incarnation. It pays faculty from, in fact, the Seminary of the Southwest to teach. The students gather once a month. And then there's instruction and evaluation. And that model, I should say, is not unique. The Iona School of Texas did not invent that model. There are other places all over the country doing it. It just happened to become really successful, such that neighboring dioceses wanted to be a part of it. Dioceses that had less access, for whatever reason, to people who were equipped to do the live teaching. And so a really unique situation emerged in which Seminary of the Southwest, with the launch of the Iona Initiative in 2011-2012, was providing curriculum for diocesan schools that were pretty far flung from Texas, like Wyoming and Oklahoma. Just for example, and a lot of dioceses in Texas. And the way that it worked back then was that faculty made a bunch of lectures on video. We literally shipped, I'm not kidding, a box of DVDs to the diocese. People gathered at a diocesan center around a VCR and watched it. There were strict rules about not taking the sacred tapes out of the place, and that was the way that it was done. But over time, something began to happen that was really unexpected and beautiful and interesting, and that's the part of the story I've gotten to watch, which is that curriculum became the occasion for the formation of real learning communities. So dioceses weren't just, showing the videos. They were having these wonderful conversations about them. So we moved to a flipped classroom model. We trained starting in 2018. We began to train Iona, what we call Iona deans, on flipped classroom pedagogy, which is best practices in adult education anyway. And people would watch those videos at home, and then they would come to the diocesan center and do all kinds of stuff, and they were doing readings, and it was becoming really rich. And I began to say, what we're really selling, if you will, isn't our curriculum. This is a community. It is a gathering of boots on the ground, theological educators embedded in their contexts from all over the country, and we come together and we convene, and we begin to talk together about, well, this video isn't working very well, or the way we're teaching liturgics doesn't really sing in Idaho, or, and so we begin to create content that was reflective of what was actually happening on the ground in these places, and a feedback loop has slowly over time begun to develop between Seminary of the Southwest faculty and the local schools that are using their curriculum, and what's even more important and beautiful to me, the congregations that these leaders go out to serve. We hear back from them, we know them, because the people who are instructors in the schools of local formation know them. And we can really adapt in ways that are beautiful. So the seminary takes the Iona Collaborative, or the initiative at that time, under its wing, and here's a little bit what we look like today. We offer certificate programs in theological studies, that's for ordination of the priesthood, the diaconate, and increasingly a lot of lay tracks. And what we do is, diocese by diocese, we help you adapt a curriculum that makes sense according to your needs. What we are is curriculum sort of developers, and so we can, and increasingly the Iona deans are also people. Usually your typical Iona dean is like a community college professor, or somebody who, we have several who are theology professors in institutions, and we work together to create, to adapt our curriculum to be appropriate to the needs of the individual school. To date, we've graduated 250 clergy since 2017, and 375 lay and ordained students are supported through Austin-based Zoom facilitated continuing education cohorts. And I'm going to segue back to that in a moment. One of the things we've learned since 2017 is that one of the pain points of local formation is that students necessarily get far fewer instructional hours than one would in a residential seminary. Typically, I'd say about half the time in the chair. And what that means is that there is a need to maximize the time we have together, first of all, which is one of the reasons we do flipped pedagogy and a lot of active applied learning, because that is absorbed much more readily than, we don't have time to listen to lecture and then go sit and meditate about it under. We've got to really use every single minute that we've got, but also our students typically need, we think, and deserve our commitment to their ongoing continuing education, particularly when it comes to really praxis-oriented things that sometimes get skimped on in the local formation setting, because we're so focused on getting people prepared for canonicals in the GOE since we have less time. So we got a grant in 2018, our first Lilly grant to launch our Thriving in Bivocational Ministry program. And then in 2019, we got our second grant, which is our Thriving Bivocational Congregations grant, because the other thing that we learned is that you can prepare ministers for these small settings, these mutual ministry settings, if you will, all day long. But if the congregations are still hoping that one of these days they're going to get it together and get themselves a real priest, then this is not going to be a successful ministry setting for anybody. And we were having priests show up in our continuing education spaces traumatized because the diocese had done nothing. They thought they were going to go out and be George Herbert in a country parish somewhere, and they showed up somewhere. It was a really toxic setting that did not want them. And so we've had to, so our congregations project is designed to companion congregations as they make the transition to what we now call bivocational church. It is a project of the whole church to make a healthy move toward a bivocational model of ministry. So now the Iona Collaborative does both local formation. It supports that curricularly. It's happening distributed in throughout the diocese, and then we have a centralized continuing education and the congregations project. Here's just a sampling of the kinds of continuing education courses we offer. This is just last semester. They're 10 weeks, Zoom-based. Part of the beauty of this is that students have an opportunity to be in cohorts so that they are hopefully forming supportive relationships with people across the church, which again is a pain point for local formation. It is easy to become very isolated if your diocese isn't intentional about including you in the kinds of opportunities that seminary-formed clergy get. It's one of the reasons I'm so grateful to the Episcopal Preaching Foundation for offering access to students in local formation to this incredible program. But that's one of our goals with continuing education, is to provide people with a network of peers so that they can continue to mentor each other. And we have a lot of repeaters who move through Zoom cohorts on a fairly regular basis, and a national network is forming of those folks. This is just a sampling of sort of what we do in bivocational congregations. This really is, we like to call it congregational spiritual direction. We have a team of spiritual directors, and we've built lots of tools that help congregations move toward shared ministry, shared leadership, shared discernment. That takes a lot of work. So that's what that program is about. Put it all together, and here is a bunch of stuff. I just want to sort of talk a little bit now about, what have we learned? We have a new why, I think. 10 years into this experiment at the seminary. It's an older experiment than that, but the seminary has been running this experiment for about 10 years. And I think it's important to admit that, that the Iona Collaborative, initially the initiative, emerged out of what was perceived by the seminary and all the dioceses participating as an unfortunate need. But we have made a transition, and we are no longer operating out of a scarcity model. So when people ask me what I do, I don't say I train people who can't go to seminary for churches that can't afford a priest. It's not what I say. I say something like this, right? I train people for ministry whose gifts would otherwise go untapped by the church. And there's a really important takeaway here that's sort of hidden in that, which is that local formation, properly understood, is absolutely not competing with seminaries. If we do this right, what we're doing is doubling, potentially, the number of people who can serve the church. People who should go to seminary shouldn't do local formation. And people who should do local formation would probably be quite unhappy and not well formed at a seminary. But that doesn't mean, to say that we are training people who shouldn't go to seminary is not to say we're training people the church doesn't want. There are lots of stereotypes about people who are locally formed that I want to take a minute to sort of disturb some of those and fill out the picture for you a little bit. So when I talk about who is local formation for, here's some of the things I sometimes say. Local formation is often best for individuals called to intentional bivocational ministry. So if you are a person, and I think this is a real calling and the church needs to name it and invite people to consider that it might be something they should discern for. If you are feeling a calling to bivocational ministry, then it may be that local formation is an appropriate choice for you. I'll put myself in this category. Most of my career, I have been a professor at Texas A&M. When I discerned a call to the priesthood, I walked into that process hoping that it would be possible for me to be bivocational for two reasons. First of all, because in my secular job, I was teaching Bible is Lit to 120 students a year. It seemed like really sad to walk away. from that kind of an opportunity. And secondly, I was doing research that had to do with the prayer book. Also, it seemed like these things there seemed to be a lot of synergy in terms of my secular job and the kinds of ministry that I could do in the church. But also, it just so happened that because I live in Texas and I'm a small town girl and know the kinds of churches and cities, towns those churches serve, I just felt a real burning desire in my heart to be a country priest. I really wanted to be in one of those little churches that was struggling to hold its doors open. And I say this as the mom of a queer kid. We're the only affirming church in Robertson County. There need to be little red doors open all across flyover country. It is a matter of life and death. It is really important that the gospel as we understand it is preached in every county in this country. And so I don't care that I'm not, it so happens that I have the privilege of not needing to be paid to do that. And if there are other people who are able, then whatever it takes. So I felt a deep calling to that work, and local formation just made sense for me. And there are a lot of people like me who pursue local formation. They tend to be people with advanced degrees in aligned fields and who have enough professional flexibility that they can sort of do the work of ministry, they're not clocking in and out every day. I say that because I think it's really important, because it, on the one hand, allies some of the concerns people have about preparation. These are really accomplished people. I actually trained in local formation with a literal rocket scientist, y'all. But also because I think I want to hold up at the same time who's not included and who's left out of that formational opportunity. It is not possible in many of our dioceses for a person who's called to bivocational ministry, but who is working class or works a job that is hourly or needs to support their family. This avenue, not open right now. And we need to do something about that, okay? So I'll just name that, but right now, that's sort of where we are. I want to take number 2 and 3 together. Individuals called to contextually embedded formation in ministry, and individuals with life circumstances that are incompatible with residential seminary. We've talked about this a little bit already, but I want to flip a script. And bear with me a moment, because this can be a little uncomfortable. I want to go back to this principle that we have, that when we train priests, we train them for the whole church. And that really is an important principle. And I want to hold it in tension with this observation, that the idea that one should leave one's place to be formed in another place, and that one is malformed if one does not leave one's home, wow. That comes with a lot of biases. There's a monastic underpinning to that we're bringing into that, and that's fine, but we should just know the history of what we're talking about. But there is also all of the baggage of white elite academia underlying that, and there are a lot of people for whom leaving their home feels like a spiritual death, and we have not honored that at all. Okay, so there are people who feel called to train in place, to be where they are. And right now, local formation, if we do our work well, sometimes we can do it in ways that aren't second class, and we need to keep striving to resolve that concern. But that is a deep need. And individuals with life circumstances that are incompatible with residential seminary, these can be people who are called to contextually embedded formation and ministry, but it can also be people, and I'm just, the picture I have here is an actual person whose story I want to name. Her name is Carol Buckingham. I took this picture myself. She is the priest at All Souls in, what's the name of that place? It is, I'll tell you. It's Casey, Wyoming, All Souls. I snuck that picture of her. I was worshiping there that Sunday. There were about 15 people there. She held that baby the whole time that she preached. She's a great example of a person who really needs to be contextually embedded. I'll tell you a little bit about Carol. Carol grew up English writing in England. She made her way to the United States with a pretty sketchy visa, so she told me over dinner, when she was 17 or 18, because she was really curious about Western riding. She showed up in California, made her way to Wyoming, fell in love with, and I quote, a real-life cowboy, and he is. And they have lived their lives in Casey, Wyoming. They are respected, beloved members of this ranching and farming community. And Mother Casey is the woman for this church. It is hard to be an Episcopalian in Wyoming. I don't know if you've heard, it's a really conservative place. And she has the gravitas and the trust to do the work. Incredible work. This church punches way above their weight. It is an actual log cabin church. There it is. And there she is. She brings her dog every Sunday. And there's a baby crawling around at the altar. Notice how she's undisturbed. And this is Rope Hope. We're an all-embracing spiritual home for everyone. I mean, I just like only this woman. Like, you have to be from here to pull this off, right? And if that little shed, do you see the shed next to the church? That's the share shed. It's open 7 days a week. It goes way beyond a food pantry. It's like everything you could possibly need. And on the day that I was there, people were already lining up for that thing, right? So that's the kind of ministry that that when we talk about people whose life circumstances and need to be contextually embedded is such that she shouldn't have gone to seminary. She did exactly what she needed to do. And then fourthly, people who need or desire a less formally academic formation experience. So again, we need centers of learning. And also, following Jesus is not brain surgery, right? It really needs to be important for us not to turn being a disciple of Jesus Christ into something that requires a PhD. And there are people with gifts for ministry and preaching who do not have academic gifts, and they can still be incredible lay preachers. They can still be incredible pastors. They can be unbelievable deacons. And sometimes it's just a matter of learning styles. Like, they're brilliant. They just haven't been to college, and they don't know how to take an essay exam, which, guess what? I have never been given in all my years as a priest, right? So it's okay. It's okay, right? So these are some of the reasons that we sometimes say people should pursue local formation. So here's some of the strengths, just to sum it up. Good things. It's adaptable, local formation. It's agile. It can and should be contextually accountable. It tends to form leaders with whom congregations identify. And it tends to form leaders who are really gritty because they're having to do this in the middle of great big lives. And they typically do absorb, I think, some static about being second class. If you have a giant ego, I would not recommend that you pursue local formation because you're going to take some hits. So I think that's some real pluses. Some things we're trying to do through the collaborative is leverage the seminary to turn local formation into a flipped seminary kind of approach that takes the resources of the seminary to support. Instead of everybody come to us, we say, we, the seminary, are a seminary for the church. And we are going to serve the needs of the congregation with these contextually embedded communities. Again, if you do it right, I think local formation encourages rigorous, correct curricular assessment because we've got less time. So we've got to get really clear about what's urgent because we owe the church. When people take their ordination vows, we have an obligation to the church that those people be able to carry out their ordination vows. I take that deeply, deeply, deeply seriously. So part of the work of the collaborative is getting very serious. This is the place where I think local formation has really fallen down historically. It makes people nervous. It's incredibly agile, but sometimes it's also really unaccountable. And so part of our work has been to figure out how to create accountability without losing agility. And then a few years ago, when it became possible for folks to get online MDivs and hybrid programs, we thought hard about whether or not we wanted to pursue accreditation. And we decided to stand where we were. with certificate programs, and here's why. Being not having to go through, if any of you've ever been through the credentialing requirements for getting accredited degrees, not having to go through that bureaucratic red tape means that we can really experiment at the collaborative. And so we've sort of flipped the script, and we don't think of the Iona Collaborative as the pale shadow of Seminary of the Southwest. Instead, I like to think of it as a lab where we can try things out that we can't try out at the seminary because ATS, we have obligations to ATS, but we can try stuff out at the Iona Collaborative, and because we're agile, if we can course correct pretty quickly, and then that information feeds back into the seminary, and then seminaries can innovate, right? So that's my dream, at least, for how it can be more effective. And that brings us to our last Lilly grant, which we just got. It's the, yay! We call it Locally Grown. It's a $5 million grant from Lilly Endowment, and it is supporting that work of that core mission of resourcing local diocesan schools. We are micro-granting $25,000 a year for 5 years to 21 dioceses in our collaborative network, all of whom have presented to us a vision for how their diocesan school can serve as an anchor institution in a predominantly rural area. So it's imagining how could schools of local formation serve a whole region, not just by forming priests and deacons, but sometimes by forming community engagers, pastoral caregivers. Western North Carolina has a plan for disaster first responders, which I thought was an amazing plan. So we said, you give us a vision. And then in exchange for our supporting your vision, we're expecting them to comply with an unbelievably rigorous student assessment cadence and protocol, and a program evaluation protocol that starts with a bunch of data gathering through FaithX, and then a semesterly cadence of student evaluation on a skills-based matrix that's keyed to the AED competencies, if you're familiar with those if you're a deacon, and if you're a priest, to the Anglican Communion grids, competency grids. We've tracked those out. And if we succeed at what we're attempting to do, we will have, by the end of the 5 years, the largest data set the church has ever had about what's working and what's not working in local formation. What we'll know is, right now, I told you lots of warm and fuzzy stories. All of this is anecdotal. We need data. Is how we're training people having an impact on the church? Are congregations better off? Are leaders able to do the things that we say that they're able to do? And this will be my last point. What's exciting about that to me is the way that could feed back into seminary formation. Because the truth is that that's a conversation that's happening at seminaries as well. How do we know that the way we're training people is really working? To what extent are these just the norms of academia versus the needs of the church, right? How would we discern what is really needed and how we're preparing people out in the world is really working? I think some of the things we're experimenting over here with might be relevant the next time around for seminaries.